All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Not Funny Guys Present Andor Season 2 commentary recap, whatever we're calling this thing. Who knows? Um, First off, let me just say right off the bat, we got an interesting thing I did not see coming. Rather than just get the first three episodes, we apparently seem to be getting three episodes at a time. And I want to say I'm okay with this. It feels a little bit completionist for me when I get the whole arc, you know. Like
Well,
I
we were just
understand,
talking about it. It's
yeah,
it's
we
every
just
it's every BBY year, it
basically
seems.
we're getting the whole year in like one go, which
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, this is interesting. And I like how when we start episode four, Ever Been to Gorman, it starts off with another quote 1 year later, and we get that Amble strike again. And then we see
hmm
it's BBY3. We find Bix is still having trouble sleeping. She's having some weird hallucination about somebody being tortured by Dr. Gorst again.
hmm
And he says everyone has their own rebellion, some little line in there. And then Cassian gets her to basically snap out of it. They're apparently living together. And it turns out, though, they don't say this at first, and it was a little unclear to me, but they're apparently on Coruscant. We find that out later.
Hmm.
Um, so, like we did last episode, I'm going to kind of bounce us around based on the planets. So this time we've got Coruscant, we've got Gorman, and we've got Dakar. And I'm going to start with Gorman.
Okay.
So we find now that Cyril is on planet and he has been working here. A lot of spider imagery in his apartment, but that's kind of a thing for Gorman. He's very paranoid. He leaves that little tie off string thing on his doorway.
hmm
We see him go through the square. We start
Which
hearing
pays
him.
off.
Yeah,
I was like, "Oh, that's a trick I'm gonna have to use if I'm ever if I'm ever
well, and then
concerned."
of course, he calls his mother. We start hearing his conversation with his mother while he's
Oh
still
God, I love
walking.
his mother. Can I just
Oh
say,
yeah,
side
Edie.
side character note? I love the mother is so good and so like
Oof.
triggering. Not because of
Well,
my mother, more
and
because of
she's
my mother-in-law.
complaining about him being like she sees it as the demotion. He tells her
hmm
it's a promotion.
but that's the same as what we saw Deidre being told, right? In kind
Yes,
of preparation, is it's going to seem like a demotion, and you're
and of
going to
course,
have to accept that, you know.
his wires are being tapped, so someone's listening in to him. We'll come to find out this is the Gorman front.
Which it
Um,
probably explains why it's such a bad signal that
yeah,
his mother's complaining
it
about
was
in the
a
phone.
yeah his mother, yeah, because if someone's interfering, you're right. And at first it starts off because we don't know this yet, but like his mother implies that he and Deidre have broken up. We'll find out that this is obviously not true.
hmm
Of course, Cyril talks about sympathizing with the Gorman people, and since we find out he's being listened to, this all plays to a certain thing. He doesn't believe the propaganda. He meets somebody interested in basically recruiting him from the Gorman front,
Who's
and
selling
apparently,
spider candies?
yeah, well, like the spider and like inside has a message for him about a
Yeah, yeah,
meeting.
and a
Uh,
candy.
yeah. He back in his apartment, he finds out that wire's been broken, you know.
hmm
And of course, he goes to that meeting eventually. You see him going to the plaza, and the plaza has a lot of significance. We'll come to find out.
Do you think
Um,
he understands the gore language more than he lets on?
I don't know. It's not exactly
I think he
clear.
gets some of it. I don't know that
He
he like. I
does.
think he understands some clearly, and I think even he kind of seems to indicate that. It's just the question is, does he truly understand the dialogue, which basically sounds a lot like French to me, by the way.
Yeah, I have some notes on that actually, but it's interesting that he has this sort of interesting interesting situation where he's obviously pretending to be a sympathizer with them to get their
hmm
trust. But
hmm
then he goes back at one point he goes back to his office during non-authorized hours, and as I like to say, he gets his what I like to call his iPad, and then he goes into the
He does, yeah.
communications room where he appears to be engaging something. Well, he's calling Deidre,
hmm
and they're basically working together, still together, I assume, based on what we'll see later. And he's playing kind of like a weird sort of triple agent, where he's
hmm
like pretending to be a double agent, but he's a triple agent kind of thing. And he's even, in my opinion, deluding his mother. And then he goes to the gathering, and there's this whole line about the quote unquote the empire is killing us.
hmm
There's a lot of clamor. People are getting out their grievances. Very tense. People getting up, giving speeches, and he meets some of the partisans who come and talk to him and pretend to translate from him. And then there's talk about what's called the Tarkin massacre, and this took place 16 years earlier. And what we come to find out, and this is something that gets revealed in the next episode, but I'll go ahead and share it now. 500 people died in that plaza. So that
Mm.
plaza has a lot of significance, and apparently it all centered around Grand Moff Tarkin, our favorite villain from A New Hope. He apparently wanted to land his ship, and the people gathered in numbers to prevent him, and he just did it anyway.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
sounds like
yeah,
Tarkin.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm about to say, yeah,
Now,
I
I
see it.
did have my note here about the Gorman. My note about the Gorman language was that it sounds like French, but maybe like a little German. Like it has some sort of weird cross points. I don't exactly
I
know for
don't
sure.
catch the German.
Maybe it's just the atmosphere. It feels
Maybe.
like, Weimar, Germany.
It definitely feels. I mean, to me, the Empire has always been a little bit of a stand-in for the Nazi Party, right? And so,
George Lucas
or vice
originally
versa.
intended them to be the Americans, right?
No.
Yeah. In the first New Hope, they are the Americans.
Oh
We're the
Lord.
Empire.
Kind of feels like we're getting back to that kind of allegory now,
Yeah.
though, for to some extent.
True. And I love the fact that at one point one of the guys recruiting him jokes, "You're not an Imperial spy."
Hmm.
He's
Hmm.
like, ha 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 ha. And of course he stays, and
No.
this is where he meets the head of the group, basically this guy Caro Rylance or whatever his name
Hmm.
is. Um,
Which sounds like a familiar name. We haven't met him before, have we?
no, I don't think so.
He
But
looks familiar too, but
they talk about the whole building, the armory, the new building. They know what it is. And
hmm.
they think Cyril might be able to help him. And so the group sort of seems to want to give off the idea they really just want peace and independence.
Right.
And it's really strange because I still haven't got to quite read with Cyril. And that I feel like Cyril, even though he is sort of betraying them, I think he really does sympathize with them. I just want to say that out loud. I feel like deep down there is a part of Cyril that is conflicted, that
Yes.
believes that might actually sympathize with these people.
So back in a theater class of mine in high school, and this isn't as bad as it is going to sound right initially, at least. One of my theater teachers, in an effort to kind of get us into a show, the Trojan Women at the time,
Mhm.
spoke about the kind of quote unquote the good Nazi, right? Someone who's
Okay.
obviously bad, someone who's
Yeah.
obviously doing the wrong things as part of the wrong side, but has a conflicted aspect to it, right? In the play The Trojan Women, the story is about, Troy falling and stuff like that, and the women of Troy and their essentially likelihood to be either murdered or sold into captivity of some sort or taken hostage, or all the different horrors that could betrow them. And also it's the story of them kind of speaking out and telling their story and being sympathizers of Troy in that way. It's very Greek theater. It's not necessarily the best of the Greek shows, but in one of it there is a moment where the women get surrounded by like men, right? Or at least in the way we did it, surrounded by fighters, by men with sticks and canes. And there is one of those who steps forward, the actor of that chorus, if you will, and proclaims, the fact that he saw one of the children being thrown from a cliff or something like that, as so many theaters do in Greek. And the way that she preached the idea of a good Nazi was for him to say it matter of factly, but also have this conflicted feeling of like, this is my duty. I live to these generals. I agree with these actions. We are here for the right reason, and yet I don't know that we should have thrown this child from the cliff, basically.
Hmm.
Right. I don't know that we should be showing this level of cruelty
Yeah.
in our win. Right. It's okay to win. It's not okay to do so with such cruelty, basically. And
Okay.
so there's
Yeah.
that confliction of like, I'm okay with the larger idea, but
Yeah.
I'm not okay with the immediate actions
Well,
of
that's a
what we're doing.
utilitarianism. That's a utilitarian ethic, moral ethics, basically, we call that kind of a utilitarian stance where you believe that the actions are necessary to produce the best outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're willing to kind of skirt the line and even do bad things, but if the outcomes are good for the maximum amount of people, it
Mm-hmm.
justifies it.
Right. The
Yeah.
trolley idea. It's
Yeah.
okay to
That's
kill the
kind of the
one for
thing.
the
Yeah.
three. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think it's interesting for me. For me, what my reasoning about Cyril being conflicted, it's in his face, like
Mm-hmm.
his facial acting. Again, with the facial acting, I said the same thing last season about Andy Serkis and when he's playing Keno
Oh
Loy,
my
like
God.
his
Yeah.
ability to just zoom in on his face and see so much, like just the
It's that
acting of
like, well,
intensity.
with Circus, it's all in his eyes. Like there's
Oh
this kind
yeah.
of flutter of his eyes. You can almost see him thinking his own thoughts, and like that's what
Hmm.
makes Circus such a great actor. With Cyril, it's not in his eyes because his eyes, ironically, are the opposite. His eyes are almost
His
dead.
eyes are kind of dead.
Right. It's really the fact that you see him.
it's in his mouth. It's like his
Yeah,
mouth and the facial contortions of
it's
his around his
cursing,
mouth.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's just his overall body language too, because
Yeah,
he
oh,
is
yeah.
such this uptight, walk with a perfectly straight back, tailored, enterprise,
Yeah.
or not enterprise, empire suits and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, why is he doing, like, it's where he's placed, right,
Yeah.
is what tells him more. Why is he constantly walking through this square versus another path, right, and things like that.
Yeah. Well, that
So
that's where we leave Gorman for now, and so we go back to Coruscant. This is, of course, where I finally kind of realized, oh, Cassian and Bix are on Coruscant. Of course, Cassian's super paranoid. He keeps his head covered because doesn't want to be spotted by cameras.
mhm,
Obviously, Bix does some small talk with the vendors. They're back at the house. They're cleaning the weapons. And then this is when Bix drops something about the mission and the soldier that Cassian killed. And this is where you start getting the connection between her nightmare with Gorst.
mhm,
Is that obviously that soldier wasn't their soldier. That was someone Cassian killed. And you start seeing that she's having a conflicted nature, which interestingly enough will kind of in a weird way get very satisfyingly in a strange way resolved at the episode by episode 6 in
mhm.
a way. But talking about Luthen wanting results, they're having to operate in darkness against the Empire, and there's this whole kind of like where do we stand with things? And of course, Cassian's kind of more comfortable with all this than Bix is at this point, because he basically says the soldier was an imperial threat. And then to
Right.
sort of reassure Bix, he says the insanity of the city keeps us safe. He's talking about Coruscant, like being on this planet. And interestingly enough, they're actually staying in a pretty decent place because they're way up in the skyline. Now, they're not super high, but the funny thing about Coruscant is where you live in relationship to how high up you are,
Yeah.
like, say, in terms of altitude, says a lot about your status.
Is
So the fact
Penthouse
that
the
they,
best?
oh yeah, Penthouse
Okay.
basically is
Yeah.
the top of the line. So like where people like Mon Mothma live, that's like where like Edie, like where Edie Carr, his mother lives, where you can kind of only barely see the sky.
Mhm.
Obviously, I think I labeled it as like being lower middle class.
Mm.
And obviously where Bix and them are living is kind of upper middle class living.
Which is
Um,
also probably the quote unquote street level where the Lutheran shop would be.
yes.
That kind
Interestingly
of
enough,
upper middle
even though I
class,
feel like he might have an
market
elevated
area.
shop, his shop is a little elevated because it seems
Oh,
like
it's
you have
definitely
to,
elevated, but that's what I
yeah,
mean. It's off the ground for sure. It's in the clouds of some
yeah,
sort.
it is. And of course, they get into this whole conversation about the insurgency, and she's trying to sort of be like all in like him. We go back to ISB HQ, and we have this whole crackdown on rebel activity going on. They've captured some supplies. We find out that Deidre's old assistant
Hmm.
is now a supervisor himself. This is Supervisor Hurt. He has now moved up, and he's now in charge of the access desks. He's in charge of hunting down basically Luthen.
Hmm.
And of course, at one point, Lonnie jumps in and sort of speaks the truth about the fact that they're arresting too many people. It's overloading information, flooding the zone. And Partagaz is aware of it and kind of like agrees that Lonnie is correct. And in a weird way, he gets kind of approached by both Largette, who was the guy he was chewing out, the semi-balding guy, and
Hmm.
Hurt, he was kind of who basically like feel and they feel like they owe Lonnie
Lonnie.
some help because he sort of bailed them out from getting
Yeah.
chewed,
Yeah.
reamed out in the meeting. And of course, Deidre starts chatting with her, and she wants to know what's going on, and he's locking her out. It's like, you blew it. I'm not chasing the glory, blah, 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 blah. Because she wants Cassian, and he gives her the kind of shoulder. And then Lonnie uses it as an opportunity to kind of chat up the guys, and he seems to be working things for favors,
Hmm.
basically for information. And then we cut to this whole thing about Mon Mothma working a whole bunch of senators.
Yeah, which
Because
was
she
interesting.
wants to basically overturn the public order resentencing directive, the PORD, um, because but everybody seems to like resist. Like there's a growing sense of fear on the rise, and
Well,
people are
there's
becoming more and more resistant to work with her.
Well, I think it comes down to a save your skin sort of thing, because she's
Yeah,
proposing policy or policy changes. She's ever the politician, still trying to push back against impending authoritarianism
she still
with
believes in the
policy.
system. She still believes in the
Yeah,
system.
right,
Yeah,
right. She believes in the Congress or the Council or whatever
yeah,
she's a part of. And so what I see it as is her going to more and more senators who are essentially like, hey, politics is where we're at nowadays, so I'm going to go with the leader of my party type thing, or
yeah.
I'm going to save my own skin and save my own seat. If you think of it by kind of
Basically,
modern
she's
terms.
just hitting a lot of stone walls, a lot of disunity.
Yeah, which are it's a great scene to show some of the aliens though, because like
Well,
for
yeah, and they
the
even talk about how
there's some great effects for those aliens and makeup and stuff at
well,
least.
she
So
even mentions the fact that there's something going on because there's a disproportionate of crime rate increases and
yeah, yeah.
arrests, and that doesn't make sense. And she's trying to make these rational arguments to these people, and they're just kind of like shrug.
Right. She's saying the planets, not the states or cities, the
Mm,
planets that had the lowest crime rates in the
yeah.
past are now seeing the biggest escalation of crime rates
Hmm.
currently. And she even actually points to Gorman at one
Yeah,
point
she
and
does.
says, "Why are they like what 30% increase or something like that?"
And then, of course, Lonnie goes and meets with Luthen again. Doesn't get a great speech this time, but he does get to tell him about the whole Deidre Mira, that he's pretty sure she's working on Gorman and that no one really knows, is being kept quiet. Um, I think he calls her Luthen calls Mira a hunter, not a propagandist. So he's a little confused about why he hasn't quite fully put together why she's on Gorman. But they know something else is going on
Right.
and that the
Well,
time for
he
waiting is
hasn't put
over.
together that she's an all-inner, right? She's one
Yeah,
who is really accepting she's the one fighting back against the rebellion, and he hasn't put that together yet.
I think he kind of understands it, but he hasn't had the full picture yet.
Right.
But he does make the note to Lonnie that things are moving faster now. Like we have this sense that things are picking up.
Right. I don't have
Um,
3 months to wait between our meetings. I'll see you again next week type
yeah,
thing.
basically. And then, of course, we get a signal. Apparently, they get a signal from this apartment safe house that lets them know when Luthen wants to meet. And so Cassian goes. Wants to go. He wants them to go meet Carol Rylance. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that when we saw Carol Rylance the first time listening in to the recording of Cyril talking to his mom, he says that he finds her terrifying,
Hmm.
like this mother of his. But I think Carol Rylance, I'm not 100% sure, but he somehow reminds me of one of the Nazi officers in Inglorious Bastards, the one they hit with the baseball bat in the trench when they're interrogating him. And he looks like
I
the officer
maybe.
they kill, not the one who actually gives up the information. I'll have to look it up, but I was just thinking about who did
Yeah,
he
I don't
remind
know.
me of. But
He did
of
look
course,
familiar, I
yeah, of
will
course,
say, but I can't
Cassian
place him.
decides he is going to take the mission, and we
Hmm.
find out that Bix is taking some kind of substance to go to sleep.
Is it a
Foreboding.
sleep or is it?
I don't know what that
I can't
was.
tell if it's a sleep or a escapism sort of drug.
Yeah, and then of course we close on Dakar, where we come back to Saul Guerrera, and that Willman Pack or Will is apparently there to drop off some sort of equipment that helps them process rhydonium, which is a volatile starship fuel.
Hmm.
And really dangerous stuff. And apparently he was just there to train somebody and leave. So I think he's working for Luthen. But Saul is like, no, you're going to stay and help us train this other guy. And Saul continues to be utterly kind of terrifying, a real sociopath.
A little bit.
Um,
A little bit.
and Will's kind of trying to sort of navigate this, but he's going to help this Pluti guy and teach him. And he's sort of stuck with him. And that's where
Hmm.
we kind of end episode 4. We come around to that idea. So now we're going to move on to episode 5. I have friends everywhere. And there's an interesting touch, very similar to what we did with season 3, where we had the title card and then we cut away to Andor
Hmm.
on the TIE fighter. This time we have radio static. And then we cut away to Luthen's shop on Coruscant, where Clea is listening to transmissions, and she's picked up a transmission from one of their listening devices about Davos Skulden.
Okay.
Now she gets interrupted by Luthen, and they talk about Cassian being on his way. Cassian looks like he goes to a diner, but I think it's just a place to pick up his information. He basically
Hmm.
gets his ID, does the whole spy craft, walks out with a bag, has a
Right.
listening piece where he gets his whole background story as he's on his way to Gorman. And then Clea goes back to listening. And apparently, Davos Skulden has discovered that one of the things in his collection is a forgery. And so now he's going to audit his whole collection. And this is bad because apparently they put a listening device
Hmm.
in one of his pieces. And they're like, oh, we got to get that back. And of course, Luthen now goes to see Bix. And he kind of warns her. Apparently, this is where we find out it's definitely a safe house. He'd been there on 2 different occasions when he thought shit was hitting the fan.
Hmm.
Um, Bix is, of course, not crazy about living on Coruscant. Luthen claims to be worried about her and careful with that drug that helps you sleep, that, all that stuff. He gives her this
Right.
whole warning. Um, she talks about using it to suppress dreams, but he talks about basically it can be addictive. Um,
which is
And
kind of
what
what we see at the end of episode 4,
Yeah,
that she
yeah, we
kind
saw
of
the zoning
settles
out. Yeah,
into
the
it. Yeah.
zoning out. And then, of course, interestingly enough, Clea is at the shop when Skulden's kind of, I guess, curator
Hmm.
comes to her talking about the problem, and Clea's prying her for more information about it. And apparently, there's going to be a whole audit reappraisal the day after a party exhibition they're putting on. So now they have a timeline where they have to get to this. And
Okay.
interestingly enough, as Cassian is going to Gorman, Cyril now arrives back on
Huh.
Coruscant. I love this part. They basically miss each other. But apparently, on the way out of his job back on Gorman, he took a data disk and I think he dropped it off and handed it off to one of the people because they wanted information on the convoys bringing materials. So
Right.
he handed that off before he left. And this is the most messed up part. He goes to see Deidre and
Hmm.
he gets 1 hour. That's all he gets to be with her.
Hmm.
And he was followed. He says he's careful. And they said they have 1 hour. You can only stay 1 hour. And then this is when they have sexy time. Oh, yeah.
Okay. I don't.
She says, turn the lights off.
Oh Lord. There
I
is.
know.
I don't know. There is something like intriguing about Deidre if you like that little bit of like, ooh, a confident lady sort of thing, but there's also this kind of like, oh God, why do I feel like she's like it's a role reversal of like 50 Shades?
I don't want to know what those two do. I don't. But then, of course, he goes to stay with his mother because he has to maintain
Uh-huh.
the pretense they've broken
Of
up.
course, of
He gives
course.
her the spider. We then see that apparently Coruscant has its own version of a Good Morning show that Bix is listening to while she's kind of like zoned out. And we find out there's some kind of big to do. I think it's the like swearing in of new senators, New Year.
Right. Right.
Um, Cyril then gives a report to Major Partagaz with Deidre, basically talking about his contact with the Gorman front. He says he describes him as being inexperienced but eager, and they're planning to bait the Gormans with outside agitators. Cyril wants the
Right.
transport schedule to remain accurate, wants to help them succeed in their raid. So they wanted him to give the information. And then at one point he makes a weird face, talking about his facial expressions. I couldn't
Hmm.
tell that he was happy, but Deidre says he's happy. She can see it on his face after he gives the successful report to Partagaz. Of course, there's nothing that he likes more than kissing up to his superiors. So,
Right. Yeah.
um, back in Luthen's shop, Clea and Luthen have it out about Skulden knowing about the fake. This is apparently not something they sold him, but they revealed the whole inspections. They have to do something about the microphone. Um, And so there's sort of like there's a debate over whether they're losing control of the situation. And they have to take out the loosening device and they now have their timeline.
Hmm.
So we'll come back to them next episode. Now back over on Goran, of course, we find out some getting back behind where we were, where Cyril's leaving. Inspectors show up at his department and basically tear it apart. One of his own workers is the one helping with the listening devices. Um, Cyril pretends, I guess, to be incensed. He returns to his office after basically being like interrogated by ISB things, and they're putting new protocols in place. The Gorman front, of course, is looking into Cyril's past, where they find out about Morlana One. In fact, his whole getting fired from Morlana One by the ISB makes him even more kind of favorable in their eyes. And of course, this is when he does the whole handing off the information disk and all that stuff. Now, Cassian, when he arrives, he is playing the part Valerian, somebody. He's a gussied up, posing as a fabric designer, like a dressed as. He checks into the hotel. They talks about the monument on the square, and we get some more information from the bellhop about the Tarkin massacre. He was 12 when it happened, and his father died
Okay.
in the incident. So he kind of wins the bellhop over, like by saying, "Oh, I don't mean to pry," and the bellhop then gives more information to him.
Hmm.
And then he goes to meet with Rylance he ends up meeting with Rylance's daughter. And there's something about the whole meeting place on Gorman. It feels very like either occupied or Vichy France in World War II. Like something about Gorman gives me all kinds of like Paris, 1942
Yeah, yeah.
vibes
I
to it,
mean,
you know?
well, this is what I mean with the whole French language
Yes.
too.
Yeah. And I think that's
It's
kind of,
very much the French Revolution sort of vibe to it. I mean, not quite
well, the
revolution.
French resistance
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the,
there you
yeah,
go.
yeah,
Maybe
the
that's
underground.
better.
Yeah. It has that. You're right. They do some shop talk. Luthen wants to speak to her father, but they're using intermediaries. There's a lot of mistrust and paranoia. And this was something I noticed in these episodes. I don't know if you picked up on this too, but the silence is like screaming in these episodes. Like things are
Yeah.
so quiet, but in a
Yes. Yeah.
really intimidating way.
In a terrifying way, almost.
Yeah. He even even Cassian points out to the girl that he knows the Gorman Front are following him. You might want to call them off. They're just making themselves look foolish. Um, he sees some protests, some minor protests that continue to go on in the plaza. And this is where we finally get to see the Imperial compound as he's on his way to meet with Rylance himself. They talk spycraft. Apparently, they got a hold of a radio and they helped a rebel pilot who crashed in the mountains. And
Mhm.
Cassian offers them a fresh code crystal for their radio so they can be secure. They want to infiltrate the facility. They tell him their plan. Cassian is very suspicious of this. He
Mm.
thinks this is a bad plan. They believe Cyril has given them the information to help them. And Cassian doesn't know it's Cyril, but he also does not like this. He thinks, and he basically tries to wave them off. And of course, Caro and him kind of part ways, not on happiest terms, because I think he smells that this is a bad idea. Because it's like you don't have anywhere to run. You're literally going to commit a crime in your own backyard, and then
Yeah.
you think they're not going to find. And then we go back to Carr. Will's trying to teach this new guy how to operate the machine. It's very deadly. Like I said, and this is confirmed, and I mentioned this earlier. It looks like, and it is the same base that the Resistance will use against the First Order in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. This is that
Hmm.
first base we see. So the rebels have nothing if not like to reuse facilities, obviously. And then we find out that basically Saul is kind of planning to kill Will
Hmm.
when he's done. He wants his trainee to keep the trainee wants to keep him. There's this kind of ruthlessness, and then the trainee basically says, Purdy or whatever his name was, says, you know, tell me what the mission is. He wants to know what their mission is. Saul's not telling anybody,
Okay.
and he tells him. And then this is when apparently Saul figured it out. And so Saul comes up to Will and Purdy while they're debating about his readiness, points a gun at Will like he's going to kill him, and then he shoots the other guy who's a
Mm.
traitor. We find out he's an ISB spy,
Hmm.
and Saul had figured out. So in a weird way, his plan worked. And they weren't actually going to conduct a real raid. They just go somewhere else to go steal the rhodinium they need. Now that they
Oh,
have this
okay.
machine. Yeah. And apparently now Will is kind of one of them. In fact, he gets a weird introduction where Saul starts telling this story about the first time he encountered Rido. They call it Rido, is a short, and how it has a smell and it'll cook you from the inside and like it's really dangerous. And he doesn't have a breather on near this machine. He's just breathing it in. And this makes me think about when we see him in Rogue One having to have that breathing apparatus. I'm like, this is why.
Hmm.
He's crazy. And he admits it. He says revolution is not for the saint. And he sort of gives this weird recruitment speech to Will, and then he makes him take his mats off and breathe in the nasty stuff and probably burning his lungs. And he kind of walks away, but it's like weirdly he's been initiated. It's like oh, weird stuff.
Hmm.
And that's where we come to the end of this episode 5. And that is actually the end of the episode is like Saul just standing there breathing. I'm like, dude, you're rotting your lungs. I don't get it. All right. So finally, final episode of our arc, episode 6. What a festive evening. I love this title.
Mm.
Now we go to Steergard, Port of Steergard, where on like a third planet, Luthen picks up Cassian. They have an entire talk. They're going their way back to Coruscant. Um, Luthen wants to know about the Gorman Front. Cassian tells him. He tries to wave him off, but Luthen is still sympathetic. He sees value. Talks about the armory. And he says the Empire will care about this raid.
Hmm.
Luthen sees it basically the Gorman Front as a potential, I guess, disposable cannon fodder.
Okay.
But he wants the new front. He wants to hit them on a new area. Luthen challenges Cassian to think like a leader, and so there's a lot of resistance and mistrust between them that starts coming out in this episode. Back on Coruscant, Luthen calls Clea at the shop, and this is when we find out that basically Vel is being sent to Gorman too. There's a backup plan.
Okay.
Once Cassian gets back, he goes back to their place. It's been cleaned up a little bit. Bix and him are having a conversation. She tells him about Luthen coming to see him.
Mm-hmm.
And then Cassian starts getting really paranoid and suspicious about Luthen. While this is going on, Mon Mothma and Perrin are in their little car talking about this dinner, an investiture banquet. That's what it's called for the new senators. This is the party. There's a ceremony at the Senate, and then there's a bunch of banquets, and Davos Skolden is holding one of these banquets. That's the one that Luthen and Clea have to get to. Cassian breaks protocol. Now, he shows up at Luthen's shop. He's pissed off about Luthen. He thinks he's playing games. They have a real confrontation. There's sort of an open question about, will Bix be a problem? Like, is she becoming a liability?
Mm-hmm.
And Cassian even says it would be easier if it was just me, isn't it? You know,
Ugh.
yeah, that one's
BBY too.
well, and then we go to ISB HQ, and Major Partagas is apparently coming to work, and he runs into Lonnie and Hurt. And
Mm-hmm.
he basically says that military intelligence, which they are not, they're just another intelligence agency, wants to use Dr. Gorse. They were really impressed with his results, and they're like, hey, can we have a hold of that guy too? And so the Emperor, the order has come down that he's going to be shared, but they're going to get some access to some military base equipment too. And he wants to make Hurt and Lonnie his two kind of quote unquote representatives. And Lonnie then puts Hurt in charge of reading the brief and says,
Mm-hmm.
you'll tell me about it, which I think is interesting because Lonnie is like, he's going to get the info, but he's not looking so eager as to raise suspicion. And
Right.
strangely enough, in this episode, we really get to see Lonnie getting much better at this. We see Deidre and Partagas talk about the planning the rebel attack on the Gorman proceedings, and that they need to actually keep the real truth about why they're doing this from Cyril. So Cyril's not being let in on the whole truth. Now, this is where I think we might see that divide come where Cyril may actually end up being a double agent in the end. Who knows?
Ooh.
If he finds out. He's being lied to, he's being played. He thinks he's on the inside, he's not.
Mm.
So Cassian starts to realize that Bix is having a problem with that drug, but she wants to go on the next mission with Cassian. Then we go to the swearing in of the senators. Mon Mothma is really uncomfortable with the whole speech that's being given.
Mm-hmm.
Like their whole oath is really like gives her like it's very much become an imperial oath.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as it's over, she leaves, and followed by her assistant. We then find Clea and Luthen and Mon and Perrin. They're at that new party, and they need to get that listening device. We do see as Mon and Luthen are coming in, we do see Senator Organa. Interestingly enough, what's his name was not could not return to play the part, so they have Benjamin Bratt actually playing uh, Senator Organa in this episode, which was
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't mind it actually. I find I was like, okay. I heard about the recasting, and I was just like, okay. It wasn't bad. It was a very short. I don't know if he'll have another show up, but it's very short. While this is going on, Deidre and Partagaz basically clear out the command room at the ISB HQ because they're basically going to be in there while this whole thing is going down. Like they're going to monitor the raid the Gorman Front is doing because they have Cyril on scene watching. Back at the party, Luthen and continues to make small talk where he loves to use small talk as a way to gather information.
Yes.
And Clea is there, and she's once again talking to the curator of the thing that she was prime information. And then Lonnie and Hurt show up apparently there, and they're also there. Also, there is Supervisor Largette, which was the other guy they kind of helped out the last meeting, and they talk about another guest coming.
That's not the Axis guy. That's the balding guy, right?
Largette, yeah, the balding guy, yeah.
Yeah.
And their guest, by the way, is Orson Krennic, so he shows up again. Luthen and Mon actually have a chat at the party. Mon asks about Vel. She has not seen her, doesn't want, she's checking in. So they get part of what's called, I guess, the chosen. They get to be part of a few people that Davos brings into the special collection. So it's like Mon, her husband, Davos's wife, Luthen, Clea, Lonnie, Hurt, Pardet, and this is where we get Largette, and this is where we finally see Krennic. And Clea goes in with Lonnie, like she needs his help. They're all having a conversation. Lonnie and Clea go over to this thing where the listening device is, and she's having him help her remove the listening device. And he's specifically using him to block the view of everybody else. And she says, if they ask, I love this piece, and starts giving him a history lesson so that he'll understand what it's about. in case they're asked, because she suspects they'll ask, why were you over here so long with this one particular piece? And so
Mhm.
she has a backstory. At one point, there's this talk about a battle of Carmine or Carmin. I'm not exactly sure exactly what battle they're talking about, but this is some leads to whole thing with Krennic and Mon Mothma getting into like a whole debate with each other that everybody watches, which is
Mhm.
perfect.
Mhm.
Um, and they have a whole thing about was it a fight for freedom or simply a feudal rebellion? And Krennic even uses the line, "My rebel is your terrorist," kind of
Ooh,
thing,
yeah.
you know. And then everybody, while everybody's fixated on this, this is when I talk about this is when I really started to notice just how quiet and deafening here.
Mhm.
And the same thing is going on in Gorman, which we'll see in a second here. But they finally get it out. Clea literally ends up cutting her hand because she literally has to have Lonnie hold this disc thing down while she's down below yanking out the listening device that was stuck. But they get
Oof.
it.
Yeah.
And then when they're leaving the party, they joke that they should have killed Krennic.
I mean, are they wrong?
Yeah. And now this is where we actually come to the actual end of the episode,
Mhm.
but we're going to be going over to Gorman. But we see Dr. Gorst going to his office. And when he opens his office door, you can see a shadow behind the door. When the lights come on, it's Bix. She straps him down to the chair and puts that listening device he did to her
Ooh,
and
nice.
then leaves him. It's very
Nice.
cathartic.
Yeah, that's good. That's
And
good.
then when she's leaving him and they're walking away, as she's walking out, she shoots a guard. Talk about coming full circle. She shoots a guard who asks her, "What? You're not supposed to be here." It's like she's got her power back.
Mhm.
She meets up with Cassian, and then he pushes a button and blows up, I think, the floor that Gorst was on. So, bye.
So the last thing he gets is his own torture,
Oh yeah,
which
yeah.
is really just great.
Now over on Gorman, we see Vel is on the planet now, and now Senta's there too, and she's got a new haircut. She cut her hair.
Hmm.
They're there basically to sort of give instruction to the Gorman front. That's really all. They have this whole thing where they talk about the kind of awkwardness of their relationship. And Belle mentions that the only reason she's here because she knew Cinta would be here. And they genuinely find that they seem to like kind of reconnect, like they do care about each other.
Hmm.
And apparently at some point she finds out they haven't spoken in over a year, apparently. Cinta apparently had some accident. She had to rest up, and Luthen never told Vel.
Hmm.
And apparently she's come to rethink her relationship with Vel and realize that, you know, she is in, not out. And so they go to meet the corporate front. They help them work out some logistics. And Vel is very cold hearted when she says prep is useless if you can't follow orders. Like they're really trying to whip this whole thing about chain of command. And they talk about the fact that only Vel and Cinta will have weapons when they go on this mission.
Hmm.
Everybody else is supposed to be unarmed. Now, this is important. Later, when they're alone, Cinta apologizes to Vel about their time apart and lying. Everything is uncertain. The mission, relationships, everything is in flux. And that the rebellion has basically put a heavy price on them they're paying. They sort of managed to reconnect. Good for them. They seem to have a real, their own little sexy time moment. Good for them. Now, when the mission's going down, the reason Deidre and Partagaz are able to watch in is because they basically got Cyril up on a roof spying on it, watching it. They sabotage the suspensors on the carrier. They take the material. Cyril's basically keeping them up. They get the cargo into their own transport. At one point, Drina, who's supposed to be their driver, leaves to help an old lady, and things start getting a little out of whack. One of the guys who was at the meeting in episode 4, the one who did the whole little fish gesture, who was kind of short statured,
Yeah, yeah,
he looked
yeah.
like he looked like an Italian mobster a little bit.
A little
He
bit.
shows up drunk.
He actually makes me think of like a French like shoresman.
Yes, no, he isn't. He shows up drunk
Marseille.
and gets into a confrontation with one of the other guys trying to
Mm.
supervise the ins. That guy brought a gun.
Gun
He
to the
gets
knife
into
fight.
a fight and the shot goes off.
Uh,
Neither him or the other guy were hit. It hit Cinta and killed her. And I wrote, fuck.
hmm.
Cyril is then given instructions to call the response team, make sure they're loud so that they want them to get away. Vel is really effed up by this. Drunk Man actually helps them get sent onto the transport. The Raiders drive away from the scene. Val goes into, like, lays into the idiot and says her death is on him, lets out all her anger and grief on him. You're going to make up for this forever, basically. And that ends the situation on Gorman. Now, one of the things I was saying earlier is that there's such an overriding sense of danger and escalation in these episodes. Each arc, in a lot of ways, is building the tension and the anger. Like
Right.
we're ratcheting things up every time. Like I'm noticing, especially
Absolutely.
now
Yeah.
in season two, what we saw in the first arc and now what we're seeing in this arc, we're turning that dial up every time.
Yes.
Everything is becoming more and more about one mistake is death. And I think that's really interesting because we know where we're going. We know
Hmm.
what we're building towards in a ways. And so it's so fascinating to know that at some point this tension is going to have to break, and I think it will break. I think the breaking point isn't the Battle of Yavin. I think the breaking point for us is going to come sooner in the season. I don't know if it's probably going to be the Gorman Massacre. Now, I don't know if we're going to get that in the next arc or in the final arc,
Right.
because I don't know exactly for sure, but I know that that will be with the inciting event that Mon Mothma will speak out a bit about against and basically have to run and join the rebellion. So I don't know if that's going to be our final arc or if that will be our next arc, because I don't remember exactly when the Gorman Massacre took place. I'm not as up on my Star Wars Rebels timeline as I probably could be, because I know they cover the other side of that because they're the ones. It's Ghost Squadron, the one with Edward Bridger and all them, are the ones who help Mon Mothma escape. So,
Are
but
you
what
familiar with the rumor that Andy Serkis may reappear as well?
I hope he does.
What
I
do you think
really
he could
wanted. I
be?
want
I
to believe.
mean,
I want to believe that Kino Lloyd joins the rebellion.
right. We didn't see him
You know,
die. He just couldn't
no,
swim.
couldn't swim. So we don't know, but I really hope we do see him again. But that brings us to the end of our recap.
It
So
does.
any final thoughts on what we're seeing here besides what I've given there with my tension ratcheting? Well,
What I think I'm liking a lot about this season is that kind of year long arc that we see over
yeah,
three
I like that we're
episodes
getting if we're going
or
to do this year-long arc for each one, I'm glad we're getting 3 episodes at a time so we get the
yeah.
full kind of experience. And what's so fascinating to me is that each one of these arcs could be its own thing.
Hmm.
And but
And
it's part of a larger thing, but it has a self-contained element to it where you get a sort of satisfying closure at the end.
right. And it's moving fast, right? I feel
Oh yeah.
like it's definitely ramping up to the battle of some sort.
Well, I think we're
I
ramping up to Gorman Massacre, but I know we're also obviously ramping up to Rogue One too.
Yes, definitely. Like, I mean, I'm curious to see how close this butts up against Rogue One, or if they try to squeeze something else in there at some point.
I will say that from what I know of this discussions about the story, this is supposed to take us up right to the moment when Cassian goes off to Caffeine, where he meets that spy at the beginning of Rogue One. We're supposed to like literally
Hmm.
get dropped off.
Yeah.
So that might be our final arc. So our next arc might be the Gorman Massacre. We might get that
I
next.
feel like it has to be if
Yeah,
the
I think it is,
if
man. I think what we're
yeah.
going to end is we're going to end with the sort of fallout. I think our end of the season is going to be the fallout and what the rebellion finally kind of coming back together, maybe on Yavin 4, you know, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree.
All right.
And kind of
Well,
the getting ready for the true battle to come, if you will,
yes.
and a
All
new
right,
hope.
so folks, I guess you're gonna have to keep an eye on. I'm getting the feeling this is gonna be a much shorter run than we expected because it's looking like we're getting 3 episodes every time.
It
So
does. It does.
we will see you next week. So in the meantime, please feel free to write into us, stuff in the description. Check out our other podcasts. We've got Off the Reels, Not Funny Guys Present Off the Reels. We talk about movies. We're in the middle of our 1992 palate cleanser, I like to call it. And then Eric, you and Casey had the horror of it all.
Hmm.
Wrestling with the
Wrestling
horror.
with the horror
Yes,
of it all.
sorry, yes. Where you guys talk horror movies and pro wrestling.
Yep, the
And
WWE.
this week we will also be having our new podcast that me and my colleague Dr. Kristen will be putting out called Not Funny Guys But Thinking About Thinking. It'll be a
Mm.
random discussion podcast about things we are thinking about.
I hope
So
people think about listening to it.
yeah, they should check it out too. But in the meantime, everybody stay not funny, and we'll see you next time. Say not funny guys again.
Not funny guys again.
No, can you say not funny guys?
Not